If you guys have been on this channel for any length of time, you know that I have a special hatred for the media spin machine, especially in the United States. Their ability to just cover stories inaccurately, incompletely, and in an ultra biased way aggravates me and was a big motivator to even like why I started the channel in the first place. So the spin machine is back up and running now because Zelenskyy has made a trip to Washington, D.C. And we are going to break down just what he's asking for and how D.C. politics is trying to extract as much voter attention as they can from this to suit their personal political desires. Let's get into it. Okay. So, if you've also been on this channel, you also know that I am a frequent, almost constant user of Ground News, and they've actually sponsored this video. But the reality is, I was going to do this anyway. I wanted to do a dedicated video for this story. So, just to give you the overview of the entire process, is that President Zelenskyy, right, is going to Washington. Probably to face a number of questions that DC has for Ukraine, right? There's been a lot of dissent, particularly among U.S. Republicans, but even among Pentagon officials who are scratching their head and questioning a lot about Ukrainian tactics in their counteroffensive, right? The U.S. spent a lot of money and a lot of effort training the Ukrainian military, only to see some fairly marginal gains, right? And we can both recognize the tremendous efforts by the Ukrainian armed forces, but also acknowledge that, remember, the Kharkiv offensive liberated all this territory here, right? The Kherson efforts, right, saw the Russians withdraw through this entire area here. So significant gains. And when we look, the current counteroffensive has produced only slivers of gains and not really in any kind of coherent strategic way. The closest we have to that is this salient right here in the Robtina region. But the problem is, you can see Russia has deployed a ton of their units to sort of box this effort in. And with the fall quickly approaching, there's a lot of concern that what we're seeing now on the map is as good as it's likely to get in terms of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which, again, when you look at what was gained in these other efforts, you can see that the Pentagon has a lot of questions about why this wasn't able to be reproduced. The political leadership in Washington that has sent a lot of aid to this effort also wanted to see results, right? And Zelenskyy, of course, has to go to both ensure continued support for the Ukrainian war effort and also to assure allies that this is still part of a larger strategy and the game is not yet up. And so, of course, anytime you go to DC, right, partisan actors, especially going into an election year, it's going to be a tough time for any foreign power, right? They're going to get squeezed on both sides. And that's one of the reasons I love I love Ground News, right? They offer us a chance to tease out the bias that can really seep into stories in both obvious and not so obvious ways. And you can see from their interface here that we can tell that this story is being covered across the political spectrum, with some right-wing outlets and some very left-wing outlets and a lot of centrist outlets like AP and, Washington Post. Actually, these are like center-left, but I'm sure it's AP, center-left, right? As well as a number of other channels, right? The Guardian Nigeria that play it center, on the center. And so we also can see the ownership of who's covering these stories. And this is what I thought was pretty fascinating, right? You can see whether they're private equity, corporate, independent, wealthy private owner. So here's sort of a little analysis of how this is going, right? When we look over at left-leaning sources, you notice that it's emphasizing Zelenskyy returns to Washington to face growing dissent among Republicans for U.S. spending in Ukraine. You also see there's an emphasis in the headlines of air defense, one of Zelensky's top issues, right? One of the things they're going to need the most in the coming winter, since it seems like Russia it will continue its winter campaign from last year of targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. There's also an emphasis on this war fatigue. And again, a drawing connecting Zelensky's desires to the skeptical U.S. Republican Party. And the reason I think you're seeing this sort of take is because among left-leaning American voters, supporting Ukraine is very popular. They are a sovereign nation defending themselves against a more powerful aggressor with some level of imperial desire. And so supporting them feels like a moral mandate, especially among left to center voters. So by associating a cause that's very popular and by positioning the opposition party, the Republican Party, against it, right, it is helping to re-emphasize or confirm a left-leaning narrative or put a left-leaning spin on this. But bear in mind, guys, that aid for Ukraine has been consistent since 2014, and there was Ukrainian support through a significant portion of both administrations, right? While Trump did get in a lot of trouble for denying Ukraine or trying to add conditions to Ukrainian aid, it still ended up going through. And Republicans, again, for the vast majority of this conflict, Republicans have voted in favor of providing aid to Ukraine in this conflict, right? It had a lot of bipartisan support really up until the last couple of months. So a nonpartisan issue becoming partisan, increasingly partisan in the left-leaning coverage. What's also interesting is that a lot of these left-of-center sites are either independent media conglomerates or held by private equity partners. When we look over at right-leaning sources, you can see that the ownership looks very different. Wealthy private owner, and corporation. So just a fascinating sort of difference in terms of who is covering this story on each side of the spectrum. You can see here, they also are introducing war fatigue into the conversation. But what I thought was fascinating is Washington Examiner, one of the largest right-of-center publications, actually juxtaposes Zelensky's trip to Washington with the government shutdown, right? So instead of associating Zelenskyy with, say, the Democratic Party, right, they're instead positioning it against a struggle that the U.S. government is facing. Now, these two aren't related. Zelenskyy is not responsible for Congress's inability to pass a budget and ensure that the federal government operates. But by linking these two, it's creating shaping a narrative that says that Ukrainian aid, right, is taking away from the ability to address real government issues, which is funny because regardless of whether Ukraine got a lot of aid or a little aid, the government would still shut down. It's shutting down for different reasons, right? Because of their inability to pass a budget. But you see here, right, this MY Northwest has almost the same line as the left-leaning outlet, but adds in the context to the headline that there's U.S. spending for Ukraine, right? Reminding the reader that this comes with a significant price tag. So instead of seeing the benefit, like air defense, you see the detraction, you see the cost, the price tag. So when we look at that, I think you can see how, unfortunately, Ukraine is being used as a political pawn or a political puppet. And the sad reality is that in the United States, issues like this that become political hot points, they can often be frozen. I actually think that, like the war in Afghanistan, and it's, as it moved into, year 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 15, the United States kind of ignored it. And that actually, in some ways, may have been to the benefit, at least of the Pentagon, and certainly to the Afghan government, that when you have these conflicts settle into the background and don't become political hot button issues, it can allow them to continue for a long period of time. Look at how many government agencies get their start amid great controversy, but then once the public normalizes to them and the media moves their spotlight to something else, that those agencies or programs can just persist for decades, even long after they are actually politically relevant. So you could see that there are Zelensky's trip has obviously involved a lot of visits to congressmen. But he did actually ask for a joint statement. Ground News actually also allows you to set up a custom feed so you can get news from whatever topic you want to focus on or care about. So you can see I created one for Ukraine. That's just every story that deals with the Ukraine war, Russia, or NATO. So you can see there's a ton of stories, but it just feeds these stories right in, including talks about saboteurs, South Korean leader, drone strikes, federal prosecutors. Ground News also has a blind spot feature that I really like, because it basically focuses on stories that aren't being reported by one side of the media or another. So, for example, the left-leaning media, almost no one is reporting this story, that Kevin McCarthy actually rejected President Zelensky's request to address a joint session of Congress. And that I thought was really interesting, because the Republican Party does want to de-emphasize and help delegitimize the Ukrainian war support. And so allowing Zelensky to address a joint session of Congress, that's a sign of a respected head of state with a message that's seen as very important. And likely, of course, Zelensky would use that platform to make the case for sustained continued aid, and not so much to the U.S. Congress, right? He can do that in individual meetings, but he'd be able to do it to the voting public, to the politically engaged public. And the fact is that only the right-wing media is reporting that McCarthy has done so, which is fascinating to me, because again, as a supporter of Ukraine, or at least broadly supporting Ukrainian aid, it doesn't seem, this is a story that kind of, irks you. If you support Ukrainian aid, you're going to be mad to see that McCarthy won't let Zelensky make this address to Congress, despite being one of the leader of a beleaguered country that is in many ways a U.S. ally. And you can see this story even is supported, even is repeated by Russia Today, which they tag, of course, as owned by the government of Russia. But very fascinating that the government of Russia, of course, they are even more cavalier about it. U.S. House Speaker denies Zelensky limelight. But it's a sign of just how often these sort of stories, these sort of biased stories, just slip through the cracks. You can also view the blind spot within a specific topic. So here's the Ukraine war page, and you can see only 8% of right-leaning sources are talking about a story in which the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Menendez, has actually demanded that 3 oil field service companies based in the U.S. Explain why they're continuing to do business in Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Russia is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world right now. and he asked these companies to cease all investments in Russia's fossil fuel infrastructure. Companies including SLB, Baker Hughes, and Halliburton, right? A company that Dick Cheney sat on the board of and won a ton of contracts to support the U.S. war effort in Iraq, are now working against the U.S., keeping Russian oil flowing despite sanctions. And this is a story, of course, that anything anti-oil, big business is probably not going to get a lot of play in the right-wing media. That's been true in the U.S. for almost a decade. But it's fascinating that this is a very relevant story, that in some ways the U.S.'s own companies are helping to kind of stab its effort in the back. Again, it's something that if you only got your news from a left-leaning source, you just wouldn't get. All in all, I don't feel very optimistic about Zelensky's trip to D.C., right? Simply because I think this is a lot of mea culpa, as much as it is encouraging continued aid. It's hard. It's hard to see this level of aid, this level of intensive preparation fall so flat. Anyway, one other thing that I thought is worth talking about is that Ground News also has an app you can download on your phone. It has almost all the same features, plus even additional features, including a map that will allow you to track news stories as they break across the world. So if you're interested in getting Ground News, right, you can get Ground News Vantage and stay informed, tease out media bias, and support a company that is doing great things in the media landscape. So you can use my link, ground.news/combatveteran, or check the link in the bio and in the pinned comment. And thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. See you in the next one.